Welcome to What I Watched This Month, 1-minute reviews of each movie I saw this month. I will be discussing the overall premise of most movies, but will not reveal any crucial ending spoilers. This month was a little lighter than usual because I was also participating in National Novel Writing Month, so all my spare time went to writing, but I still managed to see quite a few movies. Here we go. A Fantastic Fear of Everything is a comedy, maybe slightly horror, about a writer whose research into serial killers has given him intense anxiety and paranoia that he's surrounded by murderers. Most of the movie is him panicking about exceptionally small things until the stakes actually do get raised in the final third. This movie had some promise, but it squanders most of it by feeling too mean-spirited. It's exceptionally clear that this character has some mental health issues to deal with, and he seems in genuine distress. And while we're trapped inside his head with him, it feels so cruel to try to laugh at his irrational fears. When we laugh at fear and anxiety, it's usually because we find it relatable, and at first I thought I wasn't laughing just because I didn't relate that hard, but then during the middle section there's an extended scene of him panicking in a social situation, something I do relate to, and instead of feeling seen and laughing, I just felt mocked. And every punchline revolves around this fear, so if the jokes they choose to pull out of it don't land for you in the first 10 minutes, none of it will. The lines between comedy, horror, and tragedy are all thin, and this never quite tips over into comedy. Raising Cain is a Brian De Palma film starring John Lithgow as a man whose evil twin brother shows up and starts kidnapping children. It's difficult to actually summarize because the plot doesn't make a lot of sense until some additional facts are revealed about halfway through, which I figured out ahead of time, but I don't think are meant to be obviously telegraphed, so I'll leave them unspoiled. This is an obviously bad but kind of enjoyable movie. Even after the plot comes together, it really doesn't make much sense, and it includes all these long, expository, so you see what happened was scenes where characters explain the movie to each other. There's at least one dramatic scene that is supposed to be dark and sad, I think, but it's so over the top that I laughed out loud. And that plot, at one point I had to pause the movie and go find the synopsis on Wikipedia to read up to where I was thus far and figure out if I'd missed a section. I hadn't, it was just making confusing plot decisions on its own. John Lithgow is clearly having a blast hamming this up though, and I would mostly recommend this one for a group watch with a bunch of snarky friends. Sandcastle is a war movie based on a true story. Nicholas Hoult stars as a young soldier in the Iraq War, regretting his choice to enlist for college tuition. He ends up being part of a group tasked with repairing an Iraqi village's water supply, which turns out to be a difficult task. This is apparently based on the screenwriter's experiences, and it definitely has its moments where it shines. Like so many war movies, most of the characters all blend into each other no matter how much personality they try to give them, but Hoult as a centerpiece brings more charisma to the role than most of the young recruit audience viewpoint characters in similar films. It's easy to connect with his disillusionment, his frustration, his hope, and his disappointment. Without giving anything away, I thought the ending was interesting as well. Not necessarily emotionally powerful or thought-provoking, which is what I would really want from this, but it went in a direction I didn't necessarily expect. This is, however, a film weighed down by the logistics of the task they're trying to accomplish, and the scenes feel less like stories and more like checking off checkpoints in a video game, which makes the film fall flat. Dogville is a Lars von Trier movie starring Nicole Kidman as a wealthy woman on the run who ends up in a tiny, impoverished town and is willing to do whatever it takes to convince the townspeople to shelter her. The film's gimmick is that the set is actually just a giant soundstage with chalk outlines marking the presence of walls, doors, and bushes. I'm still working out how this gimmick helps or hurts the movie's narrative. It definitely puts the town's lack of material goods front and center. These townspeople don't appear to even have walls, much less anything else Kidman would have expected in her previous life, and like all Von Trier movies, it is unbelievably depressing. Some reviews bash it as being too cynical about humanity, but I do think it makes some interesting points about our own tendency to segregate and self-preserve, and about tribalism, all of which have seemed more obvious in my home country of the United States in the last 4 years. I'm not entirely sure that I grasp Von Trier's ultimate message here, but I often find his films powerful and emotionally resonant despite not being convinced of his messaging, and that is true here as well. Vanya on 42nd Street is kind of a documentary stage play. In 1994, an actual group of actors worked through performance workshops of Chekhov plays in an abandoned theater in their street clothes for no public audience. It was solely for their own artistic growth and development. And this is that play. It was pure coincidence that I watched this after Dogville, another movie with a very pared down, almost Brechtian aesthetic. And while I love the concept of it and find many of the performances very compelling, it's a movie that forces me to come to terms with one of my most guilty confessions as a theater lover and teacher. I don't like Chekhov. I find his plays tedious and uninspiring and seldom rewarding enough to make the long journey into them, and that continues to be the case here. While I enjoyed these performances, Brooke Smith and Wallace Shawn especially stand out, I'm just so bored with the stories and the characters and their long, wordy monologues about their deep-seated ideals. If you are a fan of his work, this is an immensely talented cast doing a very text-focused production, and it's worth a watch. SubUrbia is based on Eric Bogosian's 1994 play of the same name about a group of suburban young adults hanging out over the course of one night. The play and film capture the aimlessness and anger of young people struggling to find their way and turning to substance abuse, violence, art, and dreams of escaping to help themselves cope. I grew up in the suburban Midwest and did I find this a claustrophobically familiar watch. Teens and college-age people everywhere have their own existential crises, but there is something distinct about small-town coming-of-age crises, where it's just so easy to see your life just stretching in front of you as a never-ending sea of blah. Some of these characters tried and failed to get out, some tried and succeeded, and some haven't tried yet, so they still feel hopeful about their chances. Richard Linklater is a great director choice for this text because he has such a great sense for directing dialogue that is a lot deeper than it seems on the surface. There is a lot here in this film to unpack, and it's probably worth the watch. Dallas Buyers Club tells the true story of a man in the 1980s who was diagnosed with AIDS and ended up finding FDA-unapproved drugs that worked really well for him. He set up a buyers club to smuggle those drugs and sell them to other AIDS patients, despite constant raids and lawsuits shutting him down. This has a more specific timeline than most biopics, but it's centered for whatever reason not on the characters themselves so much as on the logistics of their business. It almost plays like a how-to guide instead of a story, and I would argue that the protagonist might be capitalism more than it is a human being, and that makes me kind of wonder what the purpose of this kind of movie is now, in 2013, when there have been so many other well-told stories about the AIDS epidemic. Not that you can only tell a story once, obviously, but here it means that the lack of a human center is glaringly obvious. It's obvious in the broad strokes with which the non-McConaughey characters are painted and in the intense detail and the logistics of how does one run a buyer's club. It's a strange film that gets stuck in details and doesn't do much of anything. It's hard to imagine anyone doesn't know Hamilton, but sure, I'll explain it. Hamilton is a hip-hop musical about founding father Alexander Hamilton. It took the world by storm in 2016, and this is a filmed version of the Broadway cast, starring writer Lin-Manuel Miranda as Hamilton. It's a show I admire on just about every level. It's powerful and funny and sad and makes theater and history more accessible, and it's just got endlessly engaging lyrics. I'm quite comfortable saying that Miranda is a genius songwriter. While the show itself hasn't wormed its way into my heart as deeply as it has everyone else's, I still find myself moved by it every time I see it. And in this production, the side character actors are the biggest standouts. As brilliant as Miranda is on the page, he's not smooth on the stage, and I have a suspicion that Leslie Odom Jr. was under the weather on the night this was filmed, but Philippa Sue, Renee Elise Goldberry, and Daveed Diggs absolutely steal the show. I'm not going to put the cast album on repeat anytime soon, but I'm going to keep recommending it to people because I think this is an objectively great show. Out of Africa is based on the memoirs of Karen Blixen, who moved from Denmark to Kenya to start a coffee farm with her new husband. The film focuses on her romantic relationships with her unfaithful husband, and then after they separate, with her lover, Dennis Finch Hatton. I just recently read the book this was based on and found it a little startling how very, very little of Africa comes through here in the film compared to the book. The film is primarily a romance. It's focused heavily on Karen and Dennis's relationship, with the setting functioning as a common interest between the two of them. And nearly everyone and everything coming from Africa is passed by to focus on the European transplants, and I found myself dearly missing that part of the narrative. This is so not Africa's story. It could have been set in Australia or Canada or the American West. And for a story with Africa in the title, that seems like an oversight, and especially for a story which already is kind of in praise of manifest destiny and Western colonizing of countries that aren't theirs. Aside from that, it's okay, I guess. Meryl Streep is good as always, and Robert Redford is charming. It just feels like a missed opportunity. The Ghost in the Invisible Bikini is the last of the official beach party films, and it is a very silly one. The premise is that a group of heirs to a mysterious fortune end up spending the night in the dead man's house, along with ghosts, murderers, a biker gang, a gorilla, an offensive Native American stereotype, and a bunch of people in bathing suits, because, well, it is a beach party film, even if there is no beach in sight. There are moments of this film that really work. I recall the Eric Von Zipper biker gang being the best part of the other beach party films I've seen, and that's definitely the case here. And I enjoy enjoy the framing device where dead Boris Karloff sends a ghost to help his heirs, who don't actually know him, so I don't know why he named them as heirs in the first place, but we're not here for plot. And some of the scenes with the nearsighted villainess are really enjoyable. There's also a lot of moments that fall flat. The final chase scene is too long, the primary villain sidekick is too prominent for not being funny at all, and, well, that Native American character exists. It's mostly a fun, fluffy watch, but there are a few cringy moments. Perfect Blue is an animated Japanese psychological thriller about a young pop idol who leaves her career to become a serious actress, only to find she may have a murderous fan who disapproves of the career change. The use of animation to tell this story really works. It adds a level of unreality to the story that plays beautifully with the motif of the main character wondering if she's losing her mind as bad things keep happening around her. There's a moment toward the end where the villain literally floats after our main character during a chase, still making us question how much of what our protagonist sees is actually happening. I read some comparisons to Black Swan, and I can definitely see that, though with fewer themes of obsession. And the way the plot ultimately falls into place genuinely surprised me. It's not often that a film can completely take me by surprise, so that was a delight. And it was kind of fascinating to see how the early days of the internet played into the horror angle here. Even in '97, it was pretty clear how the internet could play a role in fandom in pretty ominous ways. This is definitely worth a watch. Europa 51 stars Ingrid Bergman as a woman who tragically loses her son and ends up making major changes in the way she lives her life as a result, much to her family and friends' consternation. I found this film unexpectedly captivating, and I'm sure I can attribute much of that to Bergman herself, who often brings a fascinating combination of realism and ethereality to her roles, and both serve her well here, especially in the latter half of the film. Bergman's transition from sheltered socialite who takes no interest in anything outside her own four walls to someone willing to sacrifice everything to make one person's life better is transformative but believable, and I'm not at all surprised to see that Rossellini's inspiration was partly that of Catholic saints. And I like that despite the movie being heavily about morality and philosophy, it doesn't actually feel preachy. There is some real depth to the question of what she's doing and why, and the effect it's having on the people around her. It's an interesting, thoughtful film that I think will stick with me for quite some time. Shampoo tells the story of a hairdresser who sleeps with basically every woman he sees, and the effect that that has on his life and his business. There really isn't one redeemable character in this story, I think, with just the constant cheating and objectifying, and I would assume that's on purpose, but it's hard for me to tell what this movie is actually attempting to say about relationship ethics. There's not really any thought put into any of the many female characters. They just all blend together into one perfectly hairstyled, jealous blob, and it makes it difficult to take the misogynistic statements made by the male characters at the end as something other than the actual writer's feelings about women. Director Hal Ashby and I don't ever see eye to eye on our comedy either. There are a few almost slapsticky moments that I think are trying to be comedic, but most of them don't really work for me, and they feel out of place in the depressed aimlessness of the rest of the movie. And maybe that's the most apt description, depressed. This movie feels depressed about relationships and wants to make us depressed about them too, and so we get this. Three Generations, or About Ray, as it seems to be known everywhere but on Netflix, tells the story of a transgender teenage boy trying to get papers signed to allow him to start hormone therapy. The other two generations are his mom and his grandmother, who are struggling in different ways with this next step of his journey. The film garnered some controversy for casting Elle Fanning as the teenager, rather than a trans actor, or at least a cis male one, to match the character's known gender, but frankly, the movie isn't good enough for that to be the deciding factor in its quality either way. This is very soap opera style writing, with characters constantly emoting at a level 10 out of 10 for no known reason, and several moments of comedic relief that don't land even a little bit, and it makes the few moments that do ring genuine stand out and make me wish they were part of a better movie. Susan Sarandon as the lesbian grandmother is a truly obnoxious character. She simultaneously pushes her family away while attempting to worm her way into their business, and I think it's supposed to be charming, but it isn't, and neither is the movie overall. Rush tells the real-life story of rival Formula One racers Niki Lauda and James Hunt. The two have very different styles, both in driving and in life, with Lauda being cautious and calculating, and Hunt being an incredibly competitive daredevil with maybe a bit of a death wish. Daniel Bruhl as Lauda is definitely the most engaging part of this. He creates an intriguing character who's a very good foil for Chris Hemsworth's Hunt. The racing scenes are filmed well, and they carry some adrenaline, and I like the attention given to the dangerous nature of racing without actually romanticizing it, something most car movies do not manage to do. The film is likable enough overall, but my biggest complaint with this is that I feel like I've seen this movie before like 100 times. It's well crafted and well written and well acted, but even with one or two plot points that turn the film in a new direction, it all plays out exactly as expected, without a lot of emotional highs and lows, and that puts a cap on how much I'll love it. If you're predisposed to like biopics or sports movies or any of the actors involved, you may have a higher cap. And the movie isn't bad, it's just not great. Popcorn tells the story of a group of film students who decide to put on a horror movie festival, and as they prepare, they find a creepy film that was the precursor to a murder several years ago, and then someone connected to that film and those murders, it seems, comes back to make the film festival horrific as well. It's hard to actually describe the plot because so much of it circles around just a vague sense that something is wrong for like half the movie. One girl is having creepy dreams, there's a weird old movie, mom is getting ominous phone calls, and it doesn't really gel until much later in the film, and even then whether it makes any sense is questionable. The most enjoyable piece of this, actually, is the series of films within a film that is the group's horror-thon. They give us short segments of delightfully tropey B-movies made up for the film, all of which purportedly came with a theatrical gimmick, like pumping bad smells into the theater, and as the film group attempts to recreate those gimmicks, it feels like a really fun nostalgia trip. The actual story outside those mini-films is far less engaging and often just kinda gross, but there are some fun moments here. Bad Times at the El Royale is a neo-noir thriller about a group of strangers with secrets who all happen to be staying at the El Royale Hotel on the California-Nevada border. One of the reviews I read referred to the film as being Tarantino-esque, and that feels really accurate in a lot of ways. It's got bursts of violence and very conversational scenes and striking imagery and an incredibly evocative atmosphere, but somehow this one never feels quite as self-indulgent. This narrative serves these characters more than the other way around, and the characters are all interesting, and I can't talk about any of them in this review because it's spoilery, but one of the things they enjoyed most about this film is the pace at which things play out. We get to know the characters bit by bit, and we see their stories unfold in unexpected ways, and we start to understand how they connect to each other. The movie is nearly 2.5 hours long, but it stayed interesting the whole way through. It's not groundbreaking like writer-director Drew Goddard's previous film, The Cabin in the Woods, but its love of film is still evident here, and it's definitely worth a watch.